Hello and welcome to Dauntless Dialogue Podcast. I'm Adam Riva. This is episode 16, Malignant Feminization and the Modern World. With me today is a man who truly needs no introduction, Michael Tsarion. Welcome to Dauntless Dialogue.
Thank you so much, Adam. It's a great to be with you again. We had a wonderful conversation before, and so it's thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. Today we are going to discuss several misconceptions of the maternal and paternal dynamic and how it shapes personality development. We're going to explore the benign and malign nature of this duality. We're going to dissect the work of Eli Sagan and others who promulgate corrosive ideologies that tear apart the fabric of society. It seems to me to be the case that when a man like Freud or his ideas have become too big to ignore, the architects of control then change tactics and attempt to commandeer the message. Instead of ignoring it, they attempt to misconstrue it. Michael, how infuriating is it to see the philosophical works of great men used to peddle destructive ideologies?
What a question, and a brilliant summary there as well, because that's quite right. And that's a separate study in itself, actually. Before you can get into content, there's a whole separate study of how a Freud, a Wilhelm Reich, a Georg Hegel, and the list goes on, have been actually systematically misinterpreted. This is very much an area, that you can get into. Some are worse than others, like Heidegger, top of the, almost top of the list. Hegel, top of the list. But you're quite right to mention Freud as well. So how difficult they've made it for a novice, a well-meaning person, like myself back in the 80s and 90s, trying to come to grips with some of these people. And you can't even get to their work because maybe it's a little difficult, so you need some interpreters. And then you find that you're up against their sleight of hand and their smoke and mirrors, sometimes to actually maneuver you away from the real essence of the truth of what some of these people are talking about. And if you don't know this, then you come away thinking you're an expert because you've read this and that. And then you start pontificating. And this could be at the front of a class in a top university or just on the internet. And you're talking absolute nonsense, because how do you really know that the person said this? It's a famous classic case of Hegel and his dialectic, blah, blah, blah. The guy never used a word. If he did, it was but once and in passing. So what do you do with that? And the list goes on in the incredible misinterpretation. Now, Freud, see, these Eli Sagans and the rest of the crew, to specifically answer that question, I don't think they liked Freud. I think they saw the direction he was going and signed off, and wondered what to do. So immediately they had to step in and cannibalize some of his ideas, right? And co-opt them. And that's what I think this Eli Sagan has done, actually. That's the premise of Dragon Mother, both in the book and the articles, and also the series I did. I really bring it out more in the video series, actually. It's on Enslaved. But yeah, in the articles I do as well, because he's just one example of how they've misconstrued his teachings. But the consequences of it are enormous, because he's a heavyweight, and if you piggyback into the party on his back and then wear the T-shirt, people think, oh well, this is backed by Sigmund Freud. What an eminent guy. Okay, I'll listen to you. And all the time, it's the most subversive nonsense. And then just like Madame Blavatsky, just like Aleister Crowley, then comes Sigmund Freud. They get the bad rap, when in fact they didn't even say half the stuff that people are accusing them of.
Yeah. And in these universities, you have these pseudo-intellectual professors who will teach this stuff and they'll misconstrue it. And as a novice student to this material, the pupils in the classroom are not going to challenge this, especially when their grade depends on it. So their teachers have a platform where they have free range to completely steamroll over some of these philosophers' great works.
They do. They absolutely do. Even well-meaning guys get it wrong. This is what I've discovered. I mean, it sounds so depressing to say this. Ayn Rand has been misinterpreted. I mean, everyone has been misinterpreted. So there is a problem. So a lot of the books I write, not just the ones on philosophy, but the other ones, they're very much with this thought in mind of clarification. So it's Dragon Mother. I'm synthesizing 100 scholars, some of them from completely different walks of. Who would bring Immanuel Velikovsky and Otto Rank, and existential psychology and neuroscience together? But see, that's the art. It can be done. But even though I do that, I'm always trying to clarify in simple language for people, because we've had so much befuddlement. We really have so much obfuscation, and it's hampered, because some of the greatest 20th century proponents and PR spin doctors have been bona fide liars. But it's the old 70-30 thing, isn't it? They offer you, they tantalize you with something bizarre, and incredible that you may want to hear about psychoanalysis or existentialism, and they draw you in, and then hit you with this like sort of crypto Marxism, or we don't need to get into it, but I'm just saying they're not to be trusted, all of them. And so my work through all the years has been to try and find those few brilliant commentators and minds, like a Brian McGee, or can't think of, a Michael Talbot, let's say, or one of these other great minds who sort of cut it down to basics and made it very, very applicable. Nathaniel Brandon would fall right into that category. And I specialize in people like that, not so that the subject matter is damaged or cut up so small that, it becomes something for people of very low IQ. That's not what I mean at all. I also think that the public is intelligent. We've gone to school, we've gone to college, we can read and write. You don't need to cut things up into sound bites. But at the same time, I'm a great believer, on the other hand, that there is no philosophy, that should be so highbrow, so to speak, that it can't be simply and concretely expressed. And then we get on with the job. We as preservers, we as spectators, and then we take it into our own lives. And so this handicap of, you're employed to explain something complex, and I find you trying to equalize the complexity just because you need to jump through an academic hoop or, get a pat on the head. You're meant to blink and translate these people, not make it more complicated. And then the ones you're talking about are even more subversive than that. They may write in clear language, but what they're saying is a deep misrepresentation of the original ideas. And so I've been reading that book by Eli Sagan since 1992 or 3. I mean, I was just in America about a year and I found that book, and I've kept it with me ever since. Got a lot of wisdom out of it, but then slowly started to realize, oh my God, there's more, to the eye here. And then read it and realized, after years and years and years, how absolutely deconstructive it is. And then I was honor bound, to do something about it. And it came out in these articles on the Dragon Mother site. So yeah, it was kind of surprising, but it had been brewing for years,
Yeah. You were arguably one of the first people in the conspiracy movement to integrate philosophy and the importance of understanding psychology, because without it, you have no understanding of the causality of how some of these conspiracies bubble out from within the human condition. So maybe you can speak to that.
Yes, that's true. There's no one within this movement even today who's really doing justice to it. It's so depressing in that sense. But you're hinterlanded. I call it being hinterlanded. And we've talked about this before. When you bring up that it's not the boot on the head necessarily that's causing the state of decay, but that the slave is complicit in his own enslavement, and then that that opens up the door, begs the question of, well, why would he want to do that? And that gets you into the whole thing about the chains of gold replacing the chains of iron, all the things I get into. That's how can you come with a message to ostensibly liberate the person who's enslaved himself? It's not going to work, as I found out. So you're hinterlanded. They will run like a stampede in the direction of whoever. I can't speak the names as much as I'd like to, but they'll run in any direction they want. The moon is made of cheese, aliens, greys, chemtrails, Pizzagate, all of which are legitimate, right? We're not complaining about those, but the influx, the gratuitous the gratuitous losing oneself in the headline, so to speak. I understand what a lot of that's about. And that the ego manufactures problems, socio-political problems. You know, now we got this and we got that. There's always going to be something in the headlines. But my mentors have shown me that that's where people dive in to immerse themselves in a condition of self-evasion. And then the final thing to say on that is that then I am not totally a believer then, obviously, in the Orwellian, you know, gun to the head idea. It's more the Aldous Huxley model of you're enslaving yourself, but Big Brother has co-opted that. Well, see, this whole movement doesn't want to hear that. They want to strictly stick with the Orwellian entrainment idea. It's against your will. You know, if only you could be free of the banks and the Federal Reserve, man, you know, you'd be on your way. And they're going to stick to that. There's never going to be a change because the consequences of changing your perspective on that are so immensely radical. So anyone who even dares to come along and speak, no, it's more the Aldous Huxley thing where you are, you know, the docile body, you're happy in your servitude. You are, and that Big Brother's just signed on for that. The only thing that distinguishes them from you is that they've taken a reading of your need for self-evasion in both, you know, because we're in a post-introspective, post-psychological world right now. And Big Brother has just co-opted it. They've not done anything. They've just said, we understand that you're in a deep state of tension, self-sadism, and forgetfulness of being. Shit, thanks. You've given us our raison d'etre. We go to move now, you know, but it's the last sou. There's no, you know, it's just like you walk into, I think I said it years ago in one, where you can either be swallowed by the big fish because it's chased you and caught you and ate you, or you can educate, the big fish can just stand there with its jaws open and you sail right into its jaws. And I've stuck by that. And what we're seeing now with the new thugocracy and the rise of the extreme left, everything we're seeing now about the malignancy of the crowd, you know, the things I address in the article, I think it vindicates us. It vindicates me. And that's a good feeling. You know, I'm not against it. I know it's depressing on one level, but see, when you've been out in the hinterland for no damn good reason, anything that happens in society that vindicates your message, I'm sorry, but you have to say, well, good, because I'm tired of this duplicity on the part of the audience.
Michael, it seems that in the West, in modernity, men are forbidden from criticizing women, whereas misandry, or the hatred of men, is promoted as virtuous. Now, of course, this is basically a page torn out of the Marxist or postmodernist handbook, and anyone who studied neo-feminism knows that it was cooked up in the Frankfurt School. But of course, you know, it is possible, obviously, to criticize women and even the feminization of the West without being a misandrist, or misogynist, rather. And we all have wives and mothers and sisters and daughters and girlfriends that we can love, and yet we can criticize malignant parts of their psychology. You know, women, great women like Ayn Rand or Margaret Gage, for instance, they've contributed so much to Western civilization and to the conservation of personal liberties and to the advancement of the human spirit. So maybe you can speak to how one can criticize femininity or women in general and the trends that we see, which are pernicious, without necessarily being a misogynist.
Oh, yes, of course. One has to go into that because most people are not even what we're talking about. This crazy thugocracy and its members and its ideologues are actually quite a small, you know, demographic. Normal human beings, normal men and women don't operate on this level at all. Most women do not hate men. Most men do not hate women, right? There's admiration on both sides. And that's all I'm ever calling for is a return to that. But of course, this small group is spreading like an infection. This is the problem. In the same way that, you know, fruitcakes, you know, convert to Islam because they're tired of the, you know, the West or whatever. This thing can spiral out of control, and always, you know, it's a common truism, isn't it? It's a axiomatic that nip the thing in the bud before it gets to epic proportions where you can't really deal with it. And so that's what my work is all about. You know, I've been studying female psychology since the 80s, not because I wanted to, but because, you know, events turned that way. And then I start, as years went by, I start to see how, you know, meaningful that was, because at some point in the late 90s and definitely moving into the new millennium, I saw that masculinity was under attack. So then this is a question then not of males and females, but of masculinity and femininity, and the loss of masculinity affects women. So anybody, Adam, that gets us and say, "Oh, no, what the hell, you can counter them immediately. Go, no, I'm talking about psychological typology here, mate. Right? There's masculine women and feminized men, and if one of those goes off kilter, or actually is under attack, can you believe it? Women will be as much the victims as the men. So this neutralizes any, sort of ludicrous acid-throwing knee-jerk reactions. But the fact of the matter is that masculinity is indeed under attack, and a sane, logical, rational, unbiased person will accept that. It's so obvious right now. But I've said from the beginning, and this is absolutely provable. People go back to divination, the goddess tradition, back in 2006, and I'm making kind of comments like this, where I said, even what we know as masculinity and femininity is already aberrant. I pointed out that long ago, that masculinity as we know it is not the real thing. Femininity as we know it isn't the real thing. And so in one bizarre, again, this is turning to magic and turning to the extraordinariness of life. If you really understand that, then all the things that are happening today, as horrific as they are and dreadful as they are part of a larger dialectic. That which is false has to fall. So the kind of so in some way I have to qualify what I'm saying is that the kind of masculinity that I want to defend, something, in many ways it's not even the real masculinity. But what can you do? So it's a mixed bag here. There is the real archetypal masculinity of heroism that you find in men and women. That's what I'm an advocate of. That's what I'm a champion of. And so you have to almost, as horrible as what you're seeing, with the critical Marxists and these Marxist Fabians, at the same time, I see that from higher up, that maybe the false masculinity and the false femininity, the meta narrative is that they have to be destroyed, undercut, and this is the way that sort of like the spirit, if you will, is having that happen. And so that even though things are being burned down and deconstructed, yes, because it's from those ruins that the real thing will be restored. And I could be completely wrong here. People can argue and go, "What are you talking about?" But at the same time, there is a case to be made of the higher dialectical purpose behind world events. There are precedents for this. It's not totally harebrained. That maybe you need to deconstruct that which is false for the real thing to reemerge. It's the same thing that the Marxists got wrong. They thought when Marx replaces capitalism, his ideas, that then it's eternal Marxist utopia. They didn't realize that by their own tenets, right? This is the structure of their own quasi-Hegelian teachings. Everything is replaced, including their Marxism. So they got into a tizzy and they buried it, don't let anybody know that their own philosophy implies their own annihilation. Since in the Hegelian model, it's a dialectical process in which one thing leads to its opposite and replaces itself. Well, you guys are the advocates of this quasi-Hegelian principle. Doesn't it apply to you? So they get into a state of self-deception and go, no, that applies for everything up to us. But when our Marxism finally takes over and replaces capitalism, we're immune from the premises of our own philosophy. Okay, sell that one if you can. Well, they did. But these are the things that sometimes I think about. And again, kind of come back to the point. Maybe the kind of masculinity we've had that's being threatened now by these social justice fruitcakes is in itself aberrant. The old premise being lice, maggots come on rotten meat. Rats will be found in the sewer. So it's something that people can, mull over.
Yeah, absolutely. In your article that inspired this entire conversation, Malignant Feminization in the Modern World, you describe the current anti-male climate in the West. And I even liked how you tied in, I think you said that feminization is the twin of entitlement. And I just want to read a quote from your article here to give our listeners a bit of context about the way that masculinity is framed in modernity in the West. So I quote, "The masculine world is one of hierarchical structures and caste systems, rabid competition, affluence, capitalism, excess, and hedonism. The average male is regarded as defensive, violent, condescending, narcissistic, incorrigibly bigoted, sexist, racist, corrupt, and debauched." So Michael, if manhood is mischaracterized by all of these pejoratives, how would you describe the true state of manhood?
Well, it's easy, thank goodness, because and a lot of that's true. It just points to the malignant masculinity I was talking about. That's perfect that you found that, because that is exactly it. And it's not altogether untrue what they're saying. But the real thing is simply heroism. You see, there's precedence for everything. It's not esoteric. A woman who acts heroically, right, and that can be in the family, how she raises her children, to admire men and not despise them and lampoon them and envy them or whatever. And a man who acts heroically, who knows his masculinity, who stands up for right and wrong, who's got a strong code of values and morality, and who's willing to take on what challenges come, not to recoil from those challenges and need safe spaces and pharmaceuticals and or even the rewards of the establishment that he helps create. In one way, heroism doesn't need that proofs. It's nice to have, but if you become victimized by it, which all the academics are like that, and so many other people, that the raison d'etre of what they're doing now is not in and of itself to be an artisan or a creator, an inventor, or a mathematician. You need, the approval, the applaud of the whole Senate, and badges of meritocracy and all this nonsense. So, it's a march through the institutions. But the simple answer is heroism. And this involves the martial arts, which is a catalyst to this. One can then talk about how, if presuming that the parents haven't instilled it in you, which is where the problem arises, then people like me may have to then, sort of, spell out and propose or advise on how it might be done, But it should have been done early, when the parents introduce you to great figures of history, great figures of literature, the King Arthurs, the Sir Lancelots, the Robin Hoods, the Doctor Who's, and all of that. And so that the child can orient. And what's happening there is also vitally important. I do mention it in the article, and that is that, and maybe when we get the solutions later on, I can reiterate this, but it helps the child move so that their moral center, because really all we're talking about here is really ethics and morality at the end of the day. Their moral center isn't the superego, it's the conscience. So there's that whole debate right there. What's the difference? Why would one be better than the other, etc.? And it's not that you're going to completely negate superego. It has its function as well. Like the ego has its function, right? But if the superego is the lens, but your moral compass, well, then you got the world that we're in right now. So people think, oh, this is all Freudian, I don't get it. Well, you are getting it, because you're getting the symptoms of it all. You're living in the mess. It's like, save the world from your own ignorance and find out about some of this stuff, because it's all around you. The fact that, super ego is indeed dictating a man's ethics. So this shift is also one of the things of masculinity, where the conscience is working, in relation to the mid-welt and to the umwelt and to your society. Not so much the superego, which is nothing but the voice of the many saying, if you do what we do, even if it's going to commit genocide, don't worry, we'll pat you on the head. And this comes back to the psychology of women, because it's women, I believe, that are more inclined to be swayed by the approval of the masses and the neighbors and the peers. They're the less heroic ones. And that's okay. We're at a stage, that's just like any stage of education. Well, there's moral intelligence, there's emotional intelligence. Women have more emotional intelligence than men, but by the same token, they can be swayed, right? Because they're locked into the superego. That's what their identity is, and they got to change that and come back to the conscience. And so that's a key aspect of it, the upgrading the conscience, and that's a whole conversation of how that's done, and it will take you into philosophy and psychology. There's just no way to handle it without that. I'm sorry,
I agree that heroism is the antidote to the victimization and entitlement and all the different, deviant personality traits that we see expressed on the macro scale today. And one of the things that I've been thinking about lately is the ways in which victim narratives are promulgated by the media. Victim narratives are dominant in today's culture, and that is destructive. It leads to social entropy, because if we are imbibing that victimhood from these very well-crafted films and commercials and news pieces, then that's going to be destructive in our own lives. And that framework through which we view the world, if you view everything as oppressive, then it's going to dictate your behavior. It's going to dictate your choices. And I think that the victim Olympics and the outrage Ponzi scheme that we see today is by design. I think the architects of control know exactly what to do to keep us in a state of subservience and obsequiousness. So rather than being the hero in our own stories, we are playing the part of the victim. Instead of being revolutionary and rebellious and dissenters, we are instead, pawns. And I think that the victim narratives are the most destructive thing that we can do, because if we can align ourselves with a hero narrative, we're going to actually go out into the world and hunt down the true oppressors, the true victimizers. So what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, you've nailed it. That's it. What else can you do, right? You see the problem. You got to move that stone out of the way of your fellows coming behind you. What's the point of jumping around it and heading up the mountain when you know that you've left this barrier in the way of those coming behind you? You're no teacher. You see the problem, you have to fix it. But you're quite right. The media is the one who give the stamp of endorsement to the unheroic life, and tell you that to be a hero means to be altruistic or collectivized. See, because remember, you can't remove heroism from your being, but what you can do is you can displace it. So the member of the crowd, political crowd, whatever, it's all sorts of manifestations of it. We got it right now running in the streets of Paris. They've got to believe, right, that change, they're really affecting change. They've got to believe, with all that Sturm and Drang and the histrionics and the sweat on their brow and coming home and putting their placard in the hall and, yeah, we did it. Where's the liquor? And that whole photogenic nonsense, that's their heroism. So what I'm talking about is phenomenologically observable and provable. It's so important heroism that you'll even take the secondary, tertiary version of it. What I'm trying to say is, step into selfhood and you'll have the other version of it. But there's no question that the powers that be that you're talking about, specifically the media, they are undoubtedly the main culprit. We say, oh yeah, religion and Big Brother and all the architects of control. Media is the means by which they sell their ideas, their memes to the rest of us. And one of them is the feminization. They push it. But we always must remember, to awaken from the hex and from the entrainment, is that even those guys, even the worst of the worst, are only picking up on our need to feminize ourselves, meaning regression. We'll get into that in a minute when we unpack what really feminization really talks about. So it moves beyond a sort of a gender statement, right? But the crowd, they understand that the crowd, the many, is the way that we evade this selfhood and this personalism and this vocationalism, right? And therefore they turn it on. They just unleash all the titillation and the verification, right? And the pseudo-empathy, providing a pseudo-heroism. The guy standing in front of the tank in Tiananmen Square, it looks fantastic. It's photogenic like you can't believe, right? Waving the flag like Charlie Chaplin running down the street, with a red flag, and them all pouring out of their houses to get behind him. And all he did was he found a flag on the floor on the street, and he was trying to give it back to the truck. It had fallen off the back of a truck. Incredible comment. But the media has understood man needs an absolution for his self-deception. So we better absolve him of his personal responsibility, but also cover up the fact that he's in existential crisis and that he's itching to, live in self-forgetfulness. That he's a non-self. That he's a mass mind, that he's a shard, lost to himself, deeply, I sent you a link, we can pull that up later, that autophobia, self-hate, there's actually a condition, also known as isophobia or monophobia, the hatred of being alone. I mean, what are we talking about here? And what I'm talking about is that very autophobia is the absolute true pillar of authoritarianism, of altruism, of collectivism. All of the isms that we're finding today, socialism, and top of their list of hatreds is wisdom. So the media and the Big Brother has just worked out that we are in a condition, it's actually a condition, for goodness sake, hatred of wisdom. Can you imagine even we're talking about such a thing? People can live their whole life and never even understand that this is an actual going concern. People live their whole life and don't even know that the crowd is an institution. Sure, half the socialists are running around, right? This is, again, the paradox of everything. It's so tragic. You know, you have to laugh at what's so sad. The socialist, his mandate is to run around and fight the institutions of oppression. Come on, brothers. It's like in one of the Blake Sevens we were just analyzing. No, brother, the freedom and justice and liberty for all. You fuckers are an institution. The crowd is an institution. Oh, Blake, right? The fist that crushes the tyrant's head becomes a tyrant in its stead. Of course it does, because you are the worst institution standing. There's no institution of man worse than the crowd. And I've gone blue and nobody. It doesn't sink in. I've had incredible interviews with people, and they're completely oblivious to this, even though they claim in the other breath they've been 30 years into the research. It takes 3 minutes if you're really doing the research. But see, a lot of the so-called personalities in this movement, right, Adam, we have to be blunt here, you know, are in this evasion, and they're promulgating and purveying, you know, the whole Tweedledum Tweedledee situation, and as a, you know, all of the smoke and mirrors and the bushfires, you know, so that they don't have to deal with this fundamental underlying hatred of wisdom. But what I'm saying is, I'd love to leave you to your sleep. I really would. It wouldn't bother me. Actually, in my own personal life, it doesn't bother me. But the only trouble is, I have pulled the thread that became the rope, that became the whale in the room. Big brother, this is the methodology. So being into conspiracy and being into controversial matters, I'm stuck with it now. I have to address it, because you can't beat that whale with, you know, you can't beat it over the head and kill it unless you acknowledge the dynamic of how it comes into being. The pillar that it stands on, the real foundation, is man's hatred of wisdom and self-sadism. You have to address it, and you can't leave people in that sleep. So it's like a catch-22 situation.
It's always struck me as ludicrous how the left champions themselves as anti-establishment when they're in fact they are the purveyors of government interference and collectivism. You know, for these celebrities in Hollywood to get up and pretend like, you know, they are the authorities on a political discourse, and to shake their fists at the president or at the current administration, you know, with the NPC meme, Orange Man bad. And it's like, you guys are the establishment. You guys are the myth makers. You're the storytellers that actually influence society more than anyone else. So it's sad and pathetic how, you know, they like to position themselves, but it's the Pied Piper effect. But I want to pivot here, Michael. So Eli Sagan, in his article, insists that men unconsciously fear and loathe their pre-Oedipal mother, and this manifests in male chauvinism and sadism towards women. Sagan seems to be laying the groundwork for the quote-unquote institutional sexism argument that social justice warriors use to assert their mythology of privilege, of rape culture, of toxic masculinity. So, Michael, have you noticed how this institutional argument, whether it's, you know, sexism or racism, it seems to be deployed in a debate because it's impossible to prove. It's invisible. It's not empirically measurable. Therefore, it seems to be harder to refute for some people. So I would say that the impetus is on them to prove it and not on us to disprove it.
Yeah, but they never will, because that's the heart of their self-deception, to push us more into a post-psychological, post-introspective world. And my work is to do the opposite, you see. But you're quite right. This man's work is so cunning in a sense. To undermine masculinity, you have to shame it. And what better way than to take Freud's classic systems, descriptions of the Oedipus stages, which are largely accurate. There are problems with it, but that's almost redundant to our points. That's a technical thing, playing him against Otto Rank or Carl Jung and all that. We don't even need to get into that. His general sketch of infantile existence is largely correct. And his daughter then went on and filled a lot of the blanks that where he got wildly wrong. She sort of corrected, as did Otto Rank and others. So Well, what these creatures have done is that they've taken the essential conflict. So let's take it really slow in stages. The Oedipus stages, which are from about 2 years old to 7, are a power struggle. That's what we've got to understand. Freud didn't say it in so many words, but it's as time has went by, it becomes, feminists are the first to admit this. So there's nothing I'm saying that's extraordinary here, right? And that is a power struggle with the parents. But somehow, when everybody else is usually addressing this, it always turns out to be the father, the famous castrator idea, and the focus is on the father. And this is completely illegitimate because Freud met the mother too. And everyone around him knew that he did. But see, Alfred Adler was a card-carrying extreme ultra-socialist. Some of the Vienna Circle were, not the Vienna School. The Vienna Circle's a completely different group of philosophers, so excuse me for that. The Vienna School, right, of psychoanalysis, many of them were card-carrying leftists. In fact, Wilhelm Reich was in his early years as well. So they were sort of troubled by any of his remonstrations against women. So, the female psychology. But behind closed doors, they all knew what it was all about, right? But the Ellie Sagans picked this up, knowing what I've just said, that it's a power struggle, focus more on the male, and then make it look like your resistance, man, to your mother's influence on all those Oedipus periods. That's the problem. If you'd only listen to her, you know why you need to listen to her? Because she's the paragon of morality. And they say this with no proof. Well, we're back to that whole question. Half the shit we know, we haven't thought about. So they then present this matriarchal image. And by the way, you have to then jump into the study of matriarchs to deconstruct this. You see, so these things take you off in all sorts of directions. One of the greatest ways to unseat these Ellie Sagans and their premise is to show that matriarchy, anthropologically speaking, wasn't anything as idyllic as everyone presents it to be. So here we are. I got to take that on now, right? And I specialize in the books that do that. But anyway, getting back to the fakery and the fraudulence of it, once you sweep that away, you now include the mother in the power struggle. Why we never did in the first place, don't ask me, but there you are. Now, when you plug back the mother's influence, like Alice Miller and Karen Horney and others have done, and I'm doing, now a whole much more holistic picture, you see, of the components and constituents of the psyche come about, which then have ramifications for every other aspect of our life, taking us through the Oedipal, moving out of the pleasure principle, into delayed gratification, into the life of a teenager, then into the sexual hang-ups of the teenager, and all up, and every aspect of life then stands explained from infancy all the way to old age, once it's not so skewed, where the male is either the culprit or he is shamed, right, in regards this paragon of beauty and paragon of morality, the female, the mother. And that's where I critique that. So I critique that's not the case. And when you really observe it phenomenologically, the mother is, not in all cases, of course, but the mother is generally the orienter toward the superego, the very thing that becomes the moral lens as opposed to the conscience, right? So I'm completely diametrically opposed to these Fabian Marxists. They claim that by listening and heeding the mother's counsel, you become a full, whole being, aligned with the conscience. Well, I take the opposite. That the mother, in many cases, is actually a corrupting influence, and I, the book is all about that, how that power struggle takes place, and I approach it from a Jungian point of view. Then you shift, I shift from several different perspectives so that we can see this thing in side lighting as well, not just to make these statements, but then people can really look at it from different angles, and the same thing in the articles as well, and that power struggle is unacknowledged. It's so painful for a child to go through that it's even painful to bring to consciousness. And so one of the things we have to deal with then is psychological repression, where we don't even know that such a power struggle existed. And what's the best way out of that? Castration complex. Just start blaming the father, and put all the emphasis, because then you're blocking out the real power struggle, which was with the mother. And we're speaking sort of grandiosely here, but the essential principles there are true. And the most important, and then to round it off, when I speak then of feminization, like in the title that you open with, feminization is regression. It includes repression, but it's really regression. So the Eli Sagans and all, they're working their wonders. They're doing this. They're eulogizing and lauding the female, right? Because their greater agenda is a kind of a feminization back to the pleasure principle. So let that just be understood as well, that although I talk about feminization, I quickly widen it, using psychological language to show that it's really tantamount to regression, and heroism is the antidote to that, just to make that clear.
Sagan seems to propound that the single biggest influence on the child is the paternal figure, and that it's not just isolated to the actual individual who is the father in the family, but that the larger complex of society itself is inherently patriarchal, and that the competition we see in capitalism, for instance, is extremely patriarchal, and that hierarchies are patriarchal, and all of this, gobbledygook that we seem to hear coming out of the mouths of social justice warriors. And Sagan seems to say that, well, any male influence on the child is inherently toxic to the child. Now, Michael, imagine that you were to say in public that any maternal influence on the child was toxic. I mean, women around the world would go berserk. They would be outraged. But of course, it's completely permissible to slander masculinity in such a fashion. So what are some of the ways in which a father figure is not only beneficial, but absolutely necessary for the child's psychological development?
Yeah, that's such an enormously important question. And especially in a girl's life, a lot of what we're seeing, remember I said that the whole malignancy affects the female as well. So the father, well, first of all, the father is not seen as the father as he really is. He's seen through the eyes of the malignant mother, given that you are one. Remember, there's the dragon mother, that's a goodly figure, mythological. I use that term from mythology to represent an encircling good figure, that's going to provide and nurture. And then there is the terrible mother. So the terrible necrophilus or malignant mother, if you're in the thrall of somebody like that as a child, you don't see the father at all. So it wouldn't really matter what his role is, good or bad, because she's contaminated that image. And there's interesting ways in which that's also done or achieved. But the way to answer your question exactly is that the masculine world that you're talking about is the solar world in which we all are heading towards as a trajectory of natural psychological organic development. So the malignant mother then is defined, don't you see, by the one who inhibits that process. That's the equation. Naturally, all human beings, just as they age physically, just as their cells duplicate or whatever you want, whenever you look at it, we get taller or whatever, get more intelligent, realize there's a bigger world than just, the mother's breast and the front room. All of this teleology of expansion and higher awareness, that's moving us from what, could be called from the lunar to the solar. I mean, we're just using metaphorical terms. You can use any terms you want. Vertical from the horizontal. It doesn't really matter. But I like to use the words because Erich Newman, one of my great mentors, the Jungian, he used these terms. And he uses terms like phallic as well, solar phallic. It's very, very interesting. I kind of just shaved it off and made it really as, basic as I could. So moving from this lunar world, and we're right to be in the lunar world when it's time to be in the lunar world. There's nothing wrong with the maternal lunar world, right? It's a stage. But we're moving towards the solar world, which is the masculine. And we should be doing it. So these, these architects of control that we're talking about, these deviants, they're trying to subvert this. That's why they want to talk about mothers and women and Oedipal stages. You got to, work out why they're even interested in that stuff. Then you find out what monsters they are. But the thing is that these Frankfurt School types have worked this out because they've analyzed us. I've said it from day one. They know more about you than you'll ever know about them or yourself. And now we're unpacking what I mean by that. They've studied our, psychology and our hang-ups and all the rest of it. And they know what we're sketching out here, that there's a trajectory from the ego germ right up. And the incubation period involves almost 90% influence of the mother. So even though you may be able to enter, the solar world, they know you're carrying with you this big sack of programming, and you may not altogether be happy as an occupant and an inhabitant of the solar masculine world. And so they want to stimulate those hatreds. So it's not about individual fathers per se. It's about the archetype of the masculine and the solar. We reach for that and we enter into that world. But we enter into it in two particular ways, which has tremendous significance for what you've asked. We enter the solar world, all children, especially the male, enter for two reasons. One is as a haven from the terrible mother, to get away from her enthrallment, right, and her presence. We enter the masculine world as a kind of a reprieve from her engulfment, right? And we also do so to be empowered, like Perseus, getting the sword in his hand, because the whole thing, as I said in the previous stages, was a power struggle in which the mother was the supreme power, and you were the shivering wreck, psychologically on your knees, cringing in front of that bestial power, right, that she wields on you. So the masculine world offers you a scimitar of your own, or a club would probably be the way the feminists would look at it, and they're not wholly wrong there. But what they never explain is, why are all these malignancies that they point to so beautifully in the masculine world there in the first place? They never want to talk about the roots of all the malignancy that they're so brilliant at pointing out. They just keep snapshotting away, taking their Polaroid. Where does it all come from? Why is that there as opposed to something else? Well, that's what my job has been, to look into that, as I say, from the late 80s onwards, not having any fixed idea of where it was going to lead. So all the malignant elements that they're talking about are based in a deeper criminality, which occurs through the Oedipal stages and onwards. And part of that criminal action is the misrepresentation of the male. So that even when, through schooling and through acculturation, you enter the solar world and you try to get along, jump through the hoops, okay, whatever, win a few more stripes, you're inwardly in a terrible state of tension. And there's, as I said, you enter in not only to get a reprieve, from the power and entrainment of the malignant female, but you're rivaling her power. The masculine world matters to you, not for itself, but because it offers you a semblance of empowerment, so that you can now turn to the feminine and the female and rival its power. Why do you think we're ecocidal? Why do you think we're in a sixth extension? Because you can't go back and you can't go back and confront your real mother. She gets off the hook, or she may have died or something. But you can beat up other women. You can beat up your wife. You can be one of these, what do they call them, abusing husbands. You can go out and, just act in a most ecocidal way with nature, because nature's, has that, from one aspect, a feminine counterpart, countenance, you see. So what we're talking about is unbelievable when you get into it. So now you have a love-hate relationship with the feminine. And then there's one thing maybe we can talk about later, which is identification with the object of your hate. That's another dynamic that is the child's, way out of the terrible tension that it has, and it also links to crowd consciousness. But that's the basic sketch, is that you enter the masculine world, and but you can be very feminized because you're carrying the voice of the mother. And then when you're in the masculine world isn't perfect. It's allowed a malignant feminization to occur within it, and that's the crowd. So my definition of the crowd, drawing somewhat on Gustave Le Bon and others, although he didn't elaborate on it as much as one would have wanted, that the masculine world also permits a malignant feminization to enter into it. It's not wholly solar. So there's a lot of problems with the masculine world. I'm the first to admit it, but I know now I know the etiology of where those malignant elements come from. And one of the malignant elements is the crowd, which provides a simulacra of the womb, the surrogate womb, and other things. It provides a charge of battery power, because you're not in touch with your own inner power. You've had to suppress that, right? When a person is in self-sadism, it practically means that you've suppressed your own bioenergy, for goodness sake. And if you don't have then a personal charge of energy to sustain you, the crowd is attractive, and the activity of the solar world is attractive, because in the many, I get this kinetic charge. So that also can be explored. There's so many facets to this.
When I first heard the title of your new book, Dragon Mother, one of the first things that came to mind was I believe it's the Jungian archetype of the devouring mother. Now, one of the things that we understand now with respect to the big 5 personality types in the world is that women rank higher in neuroticism. And neuroticism is highly conducive to child rearing because you have to be highly attentive to the needs of a child. And so there's that old adage that women raise great children, whereas men raise great adults. And so this is one of the things that we see borne out on the collective. And of course, at least in the West, although I think historically this is true generally speaking across the world, is that women were the primary caregivers of the children. We see that in terms of not only mothers staying at home and nurturing the children while the father goes out to earn bread, but also in daycares, in elementary schools, high schools, all the way up through the colleges. And so I'm the type of person where I like to promote what is natural, a return to what would be organically evolved in an ideal, optimal environment, a healthy, functional environment. And it seems to me that allowing for a maternal, a maternal child, a maternal environment for the healthy rearing of children seems to be ideal. But now we see, of course, with the push of third wave feminism, that women can do everything men can do and men can do everything that women can do. And I think this is part of the destructive nature of this ideology. And I'm not here to discourage any individual woman from any individual choice, but I am here to discourage, generally speaking, women from certain behaviors, just as I will discourage men at large, on the aggregate, from certain decisions.
Yeah, you were breaking up there a bit, but I heard most of it. Yeah, you see, as we say, what the social justice wars and the advocates of the matriarchal pattern don't realize is that women have been disaffected by this whole thing we're talking about just as much as men. And so it is absolutely fallacious to imagine that women are in any sense grounded in their own femininity, or psychological creatures who have any grasping of their own criminal history, etc., etc., etc. And when Eli Sagan disingenuously, throws laurel leaves and rose petals on the archetype of the woman, you smell a rat right away, because ordinary everyday experience shows you that most women are terrible mothers, really, really poor mothers. They're like legends in their own head, but they don't know the first thing about it, and they're operating only by the instruction, you see, of the world. This is the danger, and this has been brought up by Alice Miller and many other great psychologists. And also, don't forget that Freud had it down as well, because the Electra complex, right, rivaling the Oedipus complex, running alongside it is the Electra complex, which is, mostly for girls in relationships to their mother. So if that mother, if she's a terrible or malignant mother, a necrophilious mother, has disfigured, mutilated the conscience, emotional intelligence of her daughter, then how could that daughter possibly go on to admire men? Because the malignant mother's picture of men is so vile, the daughter's bound to have picked that up. And it takes a personal work, a personal journey of discovery for that girl to, counter that, have good models of men, meet a good man or whatever, and then get into that. And of course, that's always complicated if the men she's meeting turn out to be assholes. So there's many aspects to this, isn't there? That's why we have to go sometimes deeper, because these ready-to-made solutions to these problems aren't really enough, and as Alice Miller so rightly says, we're already deeply programmed to not break what she calls the fifth commandment, which is honor thy father and mother. She's saying most parents are assholes. Most parents don't have the faintest idea how to parent. Most of them weren't parented well themselves. So what gives them in fact, one could take it even further and say that the girl who has no conception of the struggle that she's had with her mother and hasn't resolved it consciously goes and becomes a mother to replay her dynamic with her mother with her own child. So what we have is not healing and hygiene and psychological development, but we've got the simple replaying, of the problem without any solutions.
I agree. I think that humanity is struggling with an identity crisis right now. And in our consternation and confusion, we will wear whatever fashion is sold to us. And so obviously with respect to the power elite, they will market to us something which is destructive to our divine masculine or divine feminine proclivities. So for instance, one of the things that I see taking root today all across the world is androgyny. And Michael, I just want to read a quote here from Mark Passio, who, if you're not familiar with, he was a satanic high priest and eventually left when he started to sniff out the New World Order kind of eugenics influence and all of the programming that went along with that. And being a lover of the human spirit and not, someone who seeks control over it, he had a deep disdain for the institution he was a part of. So he left, and this is part of a presentation that he did on the unholy feminine. Quote, another tactic of the neo-feminism epi-eugenics agenda is the deliberate androgenization of society, which slowly homogenizes and gradually erodes the distinctiveness of both genders. When genders and gender roles become skewed and blended, strong men and women sharing cohesive familial bonds become an endangered species. As a result of that breakdown of the familial dynamic between man and woman, society becomes weakened at a fundamental level. Michael, how does that quote strike you?
Yes, it's well said. The way I've said it is like this: in these Frankfurt schools and other groups that looked at this very deeply, many of them involved, the Tavistock London School of Economics, and then these various female movements. Like I said, the women have to stand up and realize who their enemies are amongst womankind. I mean, why should we always have to do it? There's all this running around. Well, then run in the right direction. But the thing is that these forces, these architects of control, knew that if they could use the woman as a doomsday weapon, motherhood, that's it. The rest is easy. Because man's energies are taken up building the solar world. He likes it. For all its flaws, we've now given, even briefly in this last hour, we've given a definition of the solar world. It's a haven from the emotional emotionally incestuous, clutches of the terrible mother, and it provides the phallic, torch and shining sword of Perseus by which to slice off the Medusa's head. That's a big package. So man is busy doing that. He's all, and the ones who want to eat away at the foundations of that solar world and bring it crashing to the ground, and the means of doing that is regression. They have to use the female as the doomsday weapon. Do you think that means then that I'm saying that those people love women? These socialists don't understand. You're hated. You're just being used as a tool to bring down something that, shouldn't be brought down. That doesn't mean that people like me are saying, more conservative-minded people that are, it's perfect. What do you think? It's filled with injustice and holes. But we'll fix it. We've barely had the first snort of even, freedom in the West. It's barely created. If you look at it historically, it's a joke. And yet already these deconstructionists and socialists and Marxist Fabians are in there, in the Garden of Eden already, pointing out its failures, and let's collapse the whole thing. How dare you? It's like now with all these immigrants coming in, they're already the host. We're the guest when they say, don't put up, Christmas trees and crosses because you'll offend them. Well, wait a minute. How do I get, or I'm the guest and they're the host telling me that I mustn't offend them? You're in my house, pal. You don't offend me. See, so everything's turned round. But they understood that the woman is a doomsday weapon because of man's, like you said, the divine feminine. So that's my answer to that. Is that yes, the feminine within you is divine. The masculine within you is divine. And they can use this. This is how the devil really works. And we're better even, if you're going to deal with a male-female gender conflict, well, look, why don't you just start at the root with the mother-child relationship? That's all we're saying. They're clever. They know how to do it. They deal the cards before you're even a conscious adult.
Yeah, and of course, don't take our words for it, ladies and gentlemen. Why don't you go read some of Anton LaVey, who was, the founder of the Church of Satan? He even says that neo-feminism is the perfect tool by which, I think his exact words were, we can accomplish selective breeding. So they only have to control half of the human race. If they can control the female gender, then men will kowtow to their needs and follow, hook, line, and sinker because of our sexual proclivities. So right there, straight out of the Church of Satan, you have neo-feminism being admitted as one of the social engineering tactics. And it's pernicious, guys.
Absolutely it is. And women, the solution is a step up, learn what heroism is, get it for yourself, because the woman who's naturally living, especially in her maternal mode, in the lunar world, has to always remain an occupant of the solar world and not regress herself. The terrible mother, in a sense, is a regressed soul who had a very, very pernicious relationship with her mother, you see. So this is something that these Frankfurt School people have observed and realized, oh, the potentiality of this is enormous, right? This is a black hole. And because the divine feminine is involved in this, the drag factor is incredible. Let's put it another way. If you've entered the solar world, it presupposes you've come from the lunar. So you've already passed through the lunar. Well, then going back to it feels like homeliness, a homecoming. It isn't, right? This is the malignant version. But to a self-hating, autophobic, isophobic person, the return back, the active regression actually feels like a kind of a homecoming. And this is what I think, got into their minds. That's what animated these social engineers, because it presupposes you've come through it already and gone into the solar and you go, oh, I don't like it here. Too much challenge. I have to be a heroic type of person. I don't think I can manage that. And I've done my thing with the crowd and all of that, and that's good, but there's still something missing. And then slowly you find yourself regressing, right? And it's really men and women are doing this. But then the coming home, the regression can actually feel like a sort of familiarity. And yet you're in perdition. You've sold your soul. You've let go of individuality and sunk back into the swamp. As a matter of fact, I even say, I think in one of the articles, that's not where they want to leave us, right? Eli Sagan and that crowd, that's only still a halfway point. They want us to go even further back, right down into the depth of the pleasure principle. That's where the media comes in if we wanted to go there. But what that means is that they don't even want us staying at home. The lunar world is too close to the solar even for them. I mean, it's already the destruction of the ego. They're not satisfied with that. They want us to go down to what is known as the autistic, right? In the true sense of that word, by the way, used psychologically, not medically. Autism is automatics. Well, that's your body. That's the body in the wrong way, right? I was talking about the positive of the bioenergy and Reichian paradigms. This is another mode of body, which is just the physical, how would I even want to explain? The mechanical motor, it's your action man. His hands move, his head twists, right? And these soy boys and the creatures that you're seeing all around you today, that's that. They're at that automatic level. They're not even psychological. They're not the solar. They're moving around like ghosts. They're not present in the solar. They're not even present in the lunar. They've gone right back to an automatic, mechanical, robotic. And this brings up Erich Fromm, one of the great thinkers. He actually was part of the Frankfurt School. So and then he moved on and saw things in a bigger way than their narrow Marxist agenda. He sort of left and became more truly humanitarian. And it's provable by some of the amazing things he wrote and said. And one of the things he said is, forget all of this stuff about, degrading the human being, or raising the machine up to the level of the human. The human is being reduced down to the robot. In fact, he went so far and said, in the past, the problem of mankind, has been the enslavement, slavery, in that classic, sense, socio-political Marxist sort of sense. He says now, it's not about you being a slave, it's about you being a robot. And that's what I mean when I say about there's even a regression level bloody well lower. And if we're not careful, that's where we're going to end up. The lunar world might not be as, as what do you do in in a situation of complete psychological collapse. And remember, this crowd is also very clever too, because they have vilified and assassinated, right, and ridiculed anyone who tries to teach them that hygiene. In the article I mentioned Wilhelm Reich, but he's not the only one. You know, I talked about the hinterlanding, but my God, the crowd itself will literally destroy. You know, I talk in the article about a will to negation. You know, it's like almost the will to power, which is the thing that's caused a lot of this mayhem. Will to power being a commitment to a power that rivals the Stygian mother, right? Kind of already laid that down. But then there's almost another more necrophilious version of the will to power. It morphs even into a more vile thing called the will to negate. You know, pulling the scab off feels kind of painful, but also kind of, there's a morbid pleasure in peeling the scab. Yeah, take that further, and it's this annihilation is the pleasure, the last high. Holy shit. Well, what about all the drugs? What about all the pharmaceuticals? What about going down the jungle and sucking ayahuasca, which is a cult now? Man is looking for back doors to annihilation and thinking it's the greatest high, the greatest pleasure. He doesn't even know what he's doing. Well, that's what happens when the psyche's destroyed, and now the only thing is the last high, the last pleasure of your own self-annihilation. But Deepak Chopra's put a stamp of approval on it. Must be good. Timothy Leary would have loved it. This is all the anti-heroic models that are thrown up, and now they percolated into this alternative research community. We're knee deep in these frauds.
Yeah, one of the most pernicious memes that I see promulgated in the modern zeitgeist is the disposable dad, the disposable male. And this is again, if the same thing was said about women, there would be universal outrage. One of the ways in which we understand childhood neurodevelopment is the development of the amygdala. Now, the amygdala is what attunes the human sensory complex to threats in the local environment. So an underdeveloped amygdala basically means you don't sense danger in your environment, and an overdeveloped amygdala means you are, hypersensitive and neurotic to anything, and you perceive everything as a potential threat. And one of the ways in which the amygdala is underdeveloped is through prenatal and postnatal stress. And so when we look at, for instance, 3/4 of the Black community is born into single parent households where usually the father is missing, that's one of those things that can actually affect the neurodevelopment of the child and cause an underdeveloped amygdala. And so we have in the West, I would argue, our perception, our attentiveness and discernment and awareness of threats in our local environment is radically underdeveloped and underestimated. And so, again, you mentioned things like open borders, where we're letting a bunch of, ingrates in who are culturally incompatible with, Western Greco-Roman philosophy and the separation of church and state, and modern medicine and technology, and the scientific method, and constitutional principles, and all of the things that have instantiated and conserved personal liberties throughout the West, freedom of speech, etc. Those things are on the chopping block because we are importing, tens of millions of unvetted threats. And so I would argue that there's a case to be made, a pretty compelling psychological causality link between the absence of fathers in most American households and European households, and the lack of discernment when it comes to both individual or familial or even national threats.
Yeah. That's very interesting. And what I hear you saying, it has been stated by ethnologists or certain historians where they talk about that the Anglo-Saxon consciousness, and this involves Nordics and Teutonics and even some Celtic types, is that the Anglo-Saxon Caucasian type is independent. And that even when he gets together in a tribal situation, you know, way back when and everything, it's a loose connection. And some people really overstate this and say, look, you know, the Anglo-Saxon man prefers to be alone, he wants to walk out into the wilderness and the fields and be by himself, and he creates cultures in which that becomes possible. And so in this attack on the West, we get the opposite. So it started as crowd consciousness. That was a phenomena that's almost indicative of any culture. And then this influx of non-Caucasian peoples who are very, as you say, completely culturally and ethnically and what have you, collectivistic or collectivized. And that's not a criticism, it's just that's the way they are. And behind their own walls and their own, they do have countries. We're on the right, you know, there are some positives, you know, they do have their own national states that are much, much, much bigger than ours. So, but by, you know, by unleashing the beast and letting these types in, it's another attack on the essential masculine trait of aloneness, of wanting to be in nature. An Anglo-Saxon man is really the only one who ever even had this concept of aloneness, by the way. So, you know, and then you could say that this carries on into the nanny state. Although I always come back to the idea that the nanny state is just, like the crowd itself, is a womb metaphor. You know, I mentioned that in the article, if you remember, that there's this idea that, unfortunately, the inhabitant of the solar world, remember I said he's still entrained by the lunar world from which he came? One of the other phenomena that you find is the need, this was brought out more by Otto Rank, but because we cannot physically go back to the physical womb, which is the paradisical, right? You can't do it physically. So then what happens is the mind then has created womb metaphors. Now this takes us into something, you know, we couldn't discuss here in length. I do in other podcasts on Enslaved, you know, like the one on psychoanalysis. Most of the ones on psychology, I usually bring this up. All we can say in very short is that, my God, what a concept. And one can even make a case, like I do, that and like Otto Rank first did, that what we call the unconscious is actually a womb metaphor, a place where it's a simulacra of the fetal state. But as I say, we can't unpack any of these in great detail. What we can say, pertinent to the articles on Dragon Mother, is that the crowd is a womb metaphor. The global village promise is a womb metaphor. The city is already one. In fact, the word city is from the Latin meaning, you know, cetus, the womb. It's right there in the etymology proving what I'm saying. But their upgraded version, you know, the panopticanized global village is one. The nanny state is one. And so more docile bodies, more fucking moochers, right? Yeah, that's right, you know. And so you're in the solar world. So they're corrupting it from within and from without. They're trying to pull the pillars away, but they know that they've got a fifth column in the solar world. And that's who these social justice warriors and creatures of that ilk, you know, that's who they are. And there are solutions to everything we're talking about, you see, but, you know, wow, there's a whole study there, you know. But the crowd is basically the womb metaphor because it's the paradisical Euroboric sleep that we want. Like we talked about annihilation earlier on, right? It's the same thing. The pain of being a self. And the Western world is that. Now, of course, it becomes Faustian, and as I already said, given time, we need to fix a lot of all of those, you know, melodies, right? But the Anglo-Saxon Western world champions independence. If it didn't, we wouldn't have these microphones and computers, right? You know, everything. So the immersion in the thugocracy is what we're seeing now is the outplaying of this desire to immerse oneself in a sort of a surrogate womb. But why it takes on we just want to talk about one more shape that the thugocracy takes on, which we've seen, which is this running in the streets, where they are clearly the fascists, they're clearly the intolerant ones, and clearly the ones destroying our cities, is because their hair trigger reactivity is a characteristic of the crowd in its most, you know, active, like we're seeing it now. Why is that? Has to be explained a bit. And that is that, look, if you describe a self-hating person, self-shaming is involved in this, guilt, existential guilt, all the rest of it, right? Dissociation, the person in this condition doesn't want to admit that there's been a parental conflict, that I seek the power of these evil ones, I want to identify. All of that is covered up, under the Prozac smile, right? But the members of the crowd who are going to the womb of the crowd are so thorny and so hair trigger reacting against any kind of criticism, right? They're impervious to it. They'll go and chop you to pieces. They're, knocking on. They're knocking on Tucker Carlson's door. We know where you live. What is this, right? Well, obviously that personality type is so filled with self-recrimination, self-condemnation, that don't you see that a person in that state can't even take one external criticism, as well-meaning as it is, from a relatively well-meaning person. They go for them like rabid hyenas. But doesn't that tell you that then what kind of personality type they have? Now, why would you want to have a debate with them? See, you don't see me running around like Milo or anybody else. Oh, he said, she said. Fuck off. No chance. I don't want to even be near these people. I'm not going to debate with them. I'm going to wait for them to implode because I know the fuse has already been set. You can't debate with creatures like this and win points. You're wasting your own breath. Write it down in a book or a blog or a video and leave it there. These are people who are so absolutely ready to implode. And the crowd consciousness is perfect proof of this. So there's a whole look at that as well. But maybe we should finish off with some solutions or whatever. But because we've been talking about all the sort of the problems.
Yeah, Michael, I just wanted to mention one more thing. Approximately 6 months ago, I was looking at the results of a poll that was done. I believe it was just in the United States, where they analyzed the dispositions of different races and different genders with respect to their ideal worlds, their voting patterns, with respect to things like free speech and the size of the government. And what was actually most interesting was that there were very disparate results with respect to each gender and each race. And so these are numbers that you can't refute. This isn't a bias of mine. This is just an observational conclusion, is that white men actually are in favor of the most personal liberties, are staunchly defending free speech, and want the smallest government. And the women obviously want larger government than men. There are reasons for that. And I would assert that there's probably a strong link between the paternal influence. Now, this is benign. This is not some malign nature of the father. But I would say that the paternal influence on the child is one of discipline and consequences. Again, that's healthy. So when we see that play out, when we see millions or tens of millions of people in the West growing up without fathers, they've basically grown up in environments of little or no consequences. So when a strong patriarchal figure like Donald Trump walks onto the scene, you see the histrionics in response to something like austerity. Austerity is because of the understanding of consequences. So in administrations of the past, it's been about spending in excess and hedonism and things of that nature. A sense of disregard for the future. Well, when you transition out of that, when you switch out of an environment of no consequences to an environment of consequences, clearly you're going to see people outraged. And I think that that's something which is worth pointing out. And so I would love to transition into solutions. What do you have up your sleeve with respect to how people can potentially parent in a more holistic sense, or the way that they can embody this in their individual relationships? How can people act on this information?
Well, you've already sort of touched on one thing, and that is, see, in a perfect world, I wouldn't even really be against single parent families. I am against it. Any sane person would. But see if the woman was able to pick up, if the mother was able to pick up the role of the father. They didn't get on, so a divorce took place. But if she was to masculinize herself and bring this sense of responsibility to her child, we wouldn't be having this conversation now. What has happened is that women have shown they're incompetent, and they've capitulated on their human duties because they put womanhood first. What happened to you being a human being that has a responsibility to the offspring that then, and that implies a responsibility to society, to the midwell? I don't know. They've let it go. They're in some other lunar world. Because, as I'm saying, the malignant mother has a negative relationship with her negative mother. And that goes all the way back. Then I open the book with something that some people might think is unrelated, which is the ancestral trauma, but it's not related. All traumas of today, when awakened, also through resonance, awaken earlier traumas from wherever they've come from. Right? It's like guitar strings. So whether it's the government pulling rugs, like you mentioned so well earlier, to keep us destabilized, or some personal family horror or abusiveness, trauma, capital T, wherever trauma is, it awakens by resonance the deeper trauma of ancestral ages. The female then, or the male, they have bad parents, it goes on. So then, and then there's that need to replay it. But there's the taboo of going back, the fifth commandment, don't go back to your parents and duke it out. Well, what's the next best thing? It doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize why women at 16 are breeding. And the chances, the statistics showing that they're breeding earlier and earlier and earlier, there's no other answer for it. They also admit when they put these statistics out that they can't explain, because it's obviously love for the partner's taken off, he's gone. So the whole phenomenon of single mothers and then younger single mothers is explained by what I'm talking about. They're desperate to relive. So there's also a sort of a virtue in it, in a one way, because you're trying to go back and find the lost pieces of your own self. Now, inherent within every negative we've pointed out, you see, is a positive. We've already spoke about heroism and exploring what that means, not in its flagrant, gratuitous way, but in a very sensible and sane way. There's such a thing called heroes, Robin Hood, and many, what's happening here? There's heroines. Like in the Blake 7, me and Adam went into this about how many heroines do you want, in the British sci-fi? And there's plenty of them others around as well. We touched on it. Then conscience, that has to be reinvestigated. Why is that different than superego? My God, that's huge. That's one. In fact, one could say that's almost one of the biggest pieces here. My work addresses this criminal history of womankind. Let's bring that subject into the narrative. That's the solution. Feminization as regression. Lots of stuff on psychology out there. Why did this fall through the cracks? And then this classic surrogate womb concept, that our societies are actually not as solar as we might think that they are. So what this means in practical terms is, when a feminist, when a social justice warrior, when one of these critical Marxists criticize the masculine solar world, they're criticizing themselves, since the very things that they advocate as negative came about from the presence of the malignant mother. Can you think of anything more futile? Don't put the criminal in charge of the investigation. If they're going to tell you how to design a new world, I don't have much belief in it, because they don't even know the roots of their own paradox. Every single precept of socialism falls on what I've just said. Your critiques are null and void, because they're critiquing symptoms, not causes. You are the cause. So you're in a state of self-deception, and you're breeding self-deception. Right? And then you point to the womb metaphors within our society, whatever they may be, the drug culture, Woodstock, the whole thing, right? And we've got it now with the nanny state and the crowd consciousness and all the rest of that, and the media and many other more subtle versions of it. Once you see their existence in the solar world, you know then that something's wrong. And you have to address it. And you have to address crowd consciousness, which is what I do through Gustave Le Bon and Ayn Rand. This is where a lot of these people, come to bear. Gabriel Marcel and Wilhelm Reich. There's a lot of different ways of looking at this concept. Not to say you don't need crowds. The crowd has an absolutely or natural, organic reason to be there, like concerts and being amongst a festival for a time. There's an electric charge, there's a camaraderie. We're not saying negate these things, but don't use them as surrogate wombs, because something massively evil will take place from that. You'll be in the realm of Quatermass, and that's not what we want. All of that. I would say then revisiting the Oedipal stages with a new insight, to know that they're just a synonym for a power struggle. And my articles then explore the dynamics of that power struggle, right? Sticking very closely to what the original psychologists said and what later neo-Freudians, like Alice Miller and Melanie Klein, sticking very close, to what they said, actually, verifying it. I did on the Unslaved podcast, there's a premium thing I did. It's a semi-premium thing. I actually didn't put it in the premium section. It's called Great Women. And we look at some of these female psychologists, so I recommend people going to look at that. One has to then realize something else, and this is a solution, and that is that the anti-solution, right? In order to know what a solution is, you've got to look at the pseudo-solutions. And one of the solutions of a person who's in deep state of anxiety and tension is identification with the object of one's hate. In other words, you identify with the power of the tyrant, not the tyrant himself, not the terrible mother, but the power she wielded, right? There's a sort of a separation. The power was so overwhelming. It kept you on your knees for most of your childhood. It has a big, photogenic effect. Yeah, I want some of that, says the child unconsciously to himself. And the superego is the response to that. The superego literally awakens, not as Eli Sagan wants you to believe, and a mass of other socialistic Freudians and that type. No, the superego is born, this Rosemary's Baby, this monstrosity, is born from the need for you to identify with power. Nietzsche called it the will to power. And it's through the will to power then we build the world. And we also build our solar world. And that's where the problems come from, but we can explore that. What I advocate is the cessation of this and the cultivation of the will to meaning. The will to power is a subset of a greater will, right, called the will to meaning. And that takes us into a whole other discussion. One day we'll talk about it. Right now we just want to stick with this idea of you're identifying with the power of the tyrant. Yeah, why don't you go around and look at half the CEOs and the humble workers today? Examine your own motives. You've identified with the power of the tyrant. It's another way to bring down the solar world. You think you're being solar, but you're not. You've actually identified with the power that is ultimately against masculinity, that's helping to deface and disfigure masculinity. And so I explore all of that in the articles, this identification and what the hell that's all about. But what it is about, for our purposes, it's just another way of alleviating this tremendous tension within, right? Repression is one way, immersion in the crowd is one way, following Big Brother's, mandates. But there's another much more close at hand way that you do this, which is I identify with the castrating power. And in my work, I'm saying it's not the father, it's the mother. She is the chief castrator. Well, you identify with that power. The real solutions then follow this. I had to lay this down before you can really understand the solutions, because the solutions will involve the reduction of self-sadism, the reduction of this identification, and the coming into alignment with one's own power, not the power of a tyrant. And that's shadow work, or that's the term I prefer to use it, borrowing slightly from various people. Shadow work for me refers to the teachings of Wilhelm Reich, well, although he never used that term, right? But essentially, that's exactly what he's talking about. A return to the body and a revisioning of the role of the body, right? And as you return to the body with this philosophical sense, it is an act of heroism to do that. Martial arts, Qigong, Tai Chi, just even general conscious exercise or whatever, And what this means is, first of all, it's just a revisioning of the role of the body in intelligence. And it then moves from that point on to a dealing with your armoring. Because as we said, here's the real clincher for this. And this may come very complex to people who are not familiar with this, but it's a revelatory, it's a key of enlightenment. When I talked about the tension, when I talked about the repression, when I talked about the identification, right, and all of this strife and the autophobia, you see, these sound very highfalutin and psychological, but they're really bioenergetic phenomena as well. Right? Wright called it armoring. So the very tenseness and spastication of your own body, the very pollutant in your own cellular structure, in your marrow, in your very fibers, right, is the coming down to earth of a lot of the psychological stuff we've been talking about. It manifests in your structure. And if you have the eyes to see it in people, right, it's unbelievable what's happening in the West. And again, this is co-opted by Big Brother. So in addressing the real yoga, the real meditation is returning to the body to free it from identification with the object of hate, to loosen up the armoring, and better said, is to end the self-sadism. See, the will to power and the master-slave dynamic, you don't have to worry about how you're playing it out in the world. You're already playing it out in regard to yourself. This thing is unbelievable. And there can be no question of change until these points are heeded. But nobody in this movement is even aware of it. Or they're aware of it through my work, but then they, like I say, here's a ticket to Hinterland there, Michael, away you go. Until you turn to your own bioenergy and factor that in, generally speaking, health, right, the health of the body, but in a very specific sense, not working out and jogging and, you know, getting into the mechanical aspect of that's nonsense. That's, in fact, that is the power. That's the power dynamic. That's you in a master-slave relationship with your body. Jogging is the master telling the slave what to do. This, what I'm talking about is a yoga. It transforms this. It's a total letting the voice of the body speak. A complete different relationship. That's a whole art. Where do you even start? Well, you start with the body. Let it speak. Be silent. In other words, what this is all about is it's a bioenergetic problem that will unlock a lot of other doors later on in the socio-political world. But it starts, like Reich said, in your own structure, right? As we said, in a republic, right, all relationships with other people, including the malignant ones of the crowd, any and all relationships with other people are based on the relationship you have with yourself. You're just taking that out and making it explicit in the world. You're just expressing the relationship you have with your own being and your own body in the socio-political world. That's why it's in a mess. So the place to start, obviously, is with oneself. That's why I'm into personalism and real individuality. You asked earlier, what is real masculinity? It's this. It's independence. But it's independence in comportment with your own being in total, not just the intellect and the cerebral working out of. Right? That's valuable, but there's something so much more to it than this. And then people go, that sounds really difficult. Well, what are the consequences? If you do not awaken the bioenergy, or you use the crowd, or you use some other battery to stimulate you, right? You'll never awaken the power that you need to get you into your vocational life, no matter what you do. You can take as many Anthony Robbins courses and pump it till it hurts, and you can go through all the coaches, hopeless. They just put signposts out of there. You will remain on the occupational and recreational. You won't have the energy for it. If you don't have the octane in the tank, the plane will not fly. You can push it and push it and push it to get off the ground. It won't happen. And we in the West need this key, because although we were going right for a lot of, look at all the great inventors who started off the West, they had the right idea, but we got off kilter because we started to use the power of the crowd or society or whatever, you see, to animate us. And we forgot that will only keep us on the horizontal. If you want to upgrade, people are always talking about vocation and, yeah, I want to know what I'm here really on this planet meant to do, my dharma. Well, look, first of all, you need the octane to even activate that. You can't come into me and the meter's, barely moving and then talking about, Michael, I want to be an artist, or I want to be a great person and a writer and all of these things. You'll be that and more if you get your energy right. But you've expatiated it wrongly in the will to power. You've expatiated it jumping through hoops academically. It's all nonsense. So the real yoga and the meditation, it's not this Eastern mystification nonsense. Although, as I said, there are paradigms like Tai Chi, and these are ancient things. And they helped you to awaken your own bioenergy, and then, only then, is a human being able to upgrade to their vocational life out of the recreational and occupational. They're still there, always will be there, of course. But how dare we allow a life to go by, you see, when you're not activating this aspect? And then the final thing to say about it is, in the act of awakening the bioenergy, you are automatically defined as the outsider. Because obviously, in order to awaken the inner bioenergy, you have to step outside of the kinetic, the battery of the crowd. So you're automatically differentiating yourself from all the other sources. How you get that innervation, and I'm the winner, and I've jogged, and I've got the gold medal, and all that pump it till it hurts nonsense. There's a whole other comportment. And so you're the outsider. And other things flow from that too, by the way. There's a whole other discovery of what the outsider... Now, I'm not talking about some hermit, by the way. This is often misinterpreted. You're still in the world because this dynamic involves the world. But it involves a kind of psychic immunity in which you're in the world but not of it. Right? You're the Socratic sage who's released himself from the cave of shadows, but you're quite capable of going into it immune to free your brothers, you see. And this is a tremendous aspect of it as well. But those are the basic solutions, and people can really contemplate those. And on a more practical day-to-day level, break the fucking fifth commandment. Your parents aren't fucking gods. What are you thinking? I said in the Great Mother, I said in the Great Women podcast, how many of these shows I've seen, they're quite popular in certain channels where, goth girl goes back to confront father who molested her, or, made her life a misery years before. Now she's got up a bit of guts, and the cameras are there, and they're going to, go and knock on the door, and she's going to get into it. And the motherfucker opens the door, and she's hugging him and crying. And, don't break the fifth commandment. And she dutifully doesn't do so. Well, what the fuck's that then? What is this? You've just violated yourself. In allowing that person to feel forgiven, you have violated your own body, your own being, your own higher spirit. And it's another form of repression has come in, and docility. What stopped you from getting up in their face and calling them out? Is that really so awful? Well, yes, it's breaking the fifth commandment. So there's a solution. Break it. It'll make you better parents on your children. It'll make you more responsible. So probably we can leave it there, but there's so much to be explored in all of this. I hope, and I'm so glad that you brought me on, because it's, I do very few interviews now because of the, I don't want to be interviewed by fruitcakes. So you're an exception here. People have to wrap their heads around some of this stuff, and I will now only, be interviewed where it matters most. Time is too precious. I'm working on different other projects, And so, again, we hope to have you back on Unslaved, Adam, real soon. But again, personal thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Michael. This has been a lot of fun. And I guess the only thing I would add to that beautiful explanation is, you had mentioned surrogate mothers. And I think a good way for people to conceptualize this or illustrate it in their mind's eye is the Shire. And if you never leave the Shire, you'll never go on an adventure. You'll never experience adversity. You'll be devoid of experiences that matter, meaningful experiences. And if you spend your whole life in that surrogate womb, sure, it's warm and your needs are met and things are nice and peaceful, but the adventure and the adversity is what strengthens the character. We are, blades that are cast in the fire. So go out into the world, experience life, and understand that, the adversity is there to refine you, to refine the human condition. It will make you better. Don't quit. And this has been a lot of fun, Michael. Thank you so much. I'm excited to have you back on in the future, and I'm sure a lot of people are looking forward with great anticipation to the release of Dragon Mother. When can people expect that?
Oh, it's out. It's already out.
It's out. Okay.
It's out right now on Amazon, or just go to michaeltsarion.com. You'll see the link. Also go to dragonmother.org, because as supplemental, I did the 3 articles there. They're not the same content as the book. They're further thoughts, because as we're unpacking this as we go, we just did the one, Hatred of Wisdom, a few months ago, based on more of a Gabrielle Marcel, because I like to turn things around and look at things from different perspectives. And Gabrielle Marcel was a personalist and a great existentialist, and he is the one from whom I get the term hatred of wisdom. So go check that article out and hit me back with feedback. You look at the links. The greatest solution is bringing all of this into the narrative. So this is the one of the very few interviews we've even had an opportunity to do outside of Unslaved, Adam. So again, hopefully we can do it again, and we'll certainly have you back as well to talk more about your own interests.
Fantastic.
Contemporaneously.
Fantastic, Michael. It's been an honor. It's been a pleasure. It's been a lot of fun. If you are a fan of Dauntless Dialogue, you guys can support us. You can head over to patreon.com. We've got some perks there. You can buy merchandise at teespring.com. Share this video if you found this valuable. That's the best way that you can support us, is to get this information out, share it, start a conversation, and get this information into the hands of those who need that kind of medicine. This is medicine for the soul. As Michael said, it's shadow work. This is making the unconscious conscious, and this is truly medicinal for Earth and her people. So, Michael, we'll look forward to seeing you again in the future, and we'll end it here. See you guys in the next episode.